Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Wealth and Wisdom. Today we are analyzing the history of usury throughout the world. The concept of usury has a long historical life, throughout most of which it has been understood to refer to the practice of charging financial interest in excess of the principal amount of a loan, although in some instances and more especially in more recent times, it has been interpreted as interest above the legal or socially acceptable rate. Accepting this broad definition for the moment, the practice of usury can be traced back approximately 4,000 years, and during its subsequent history it has been repeatedly condemned, prohibited, scorned and restricted, mainly on moral, ethical, religious and legal grounds. Among its most visible and vocal critics have been the religious institutions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam and Christianity. To this list may be added ancient Western philosophers and politicians, as well as various modern socio-economic reformers. In this video we will outline briefly the history of this critique of usury. Among the oldest known references to usury are to be found in ancient Indian religious manuscripts. The earliest such record derives from the Vedic texts of ancient India, 2000–1400 BC, in which the usurer, Kusidin, is mentioned several times and interpreted as any lender at interest. More frequent and detailed references to interest payment are to be found in the later sutra texts, 700–100 BC, as well as the Buddhist Jatakas, 600–400 BC. It is during this latter period that the first sentiments of contempt for usury are expressed. For example, Vasishtha, a well-known Hindu lawmaker of that time, made a special law which forbade the higher castes of brahmanas, priests, and kshatriyas, warriors, from being usurers or lenders at interest. Also, in the Jatakas, usury is referred to in a demeaning manner. Hypocritical ascetics are accused of practicing it. By the 2nd century AD, however, usury had become a more relative term. As is implied in the laws of Manu of that time, stipulated interest beyond the legal rate being against the law cannot be recovered. They call that a usurious way of lending. This dilution of the concept of usury seems to have continued through the remaining course of Indian history, so that today, while it is still condemned in principle, usury refers only to interest charged above the prevailing socially accepted range and is no longer prohibited or controlled in any significant way. Among the ancient Western philosophers who condemned usury can be named Plato, Aristotle, the two Catos, Cicero, Seneca and Plutarch. Evidence that these sentiments found a concurrent manifestation in the civil law of that period can be seen, for example, from the Lex Geniutia reforms in Republican Rome, 340 BC, which outlawed interest altogether. Nevertheless, in practice, ways of evading such legislation were found, and by the last period of the Republic, usury was once again rife. It was the Democratic Party in Rome who rededicated themselves to the cause of those suffering the burden of debt, and under the banner of Julius Caesar, a ceiling on interest rates of 12% was set, and later under Justinian, lowered even further to between 4% and 8%. Clearly, this left fertile ground for the assault on usury, which the Church would mount following its Christianization of the Roman Empire. Criticism of usury in Judaism has its roots in several biblical passages in which the taking of interest is either forbidden, discouraged or scorned. The Hebrew word for interest is neshek, literally meaning a bite, and is believed to refer to the exaction of interest from the point of view of the debtor. In the associated Exodus and Leviticus texts, the word almost certainly applies only to lending to the poor and destitute, while in Deuteronomy, the prohibition is extended to include all money lending, excluding only business dealings with foreigners. In the Levitical text, the words tarbut or marbut are also used to refer to the recovery of interest by the creditor. In addition to these biblical roots are various Talmudic extensions of the prohibitions of interest, known as avak ribot, literally, the dust of interest, which apply. Despite its Judaic roots, the critique of usury was most fervently taken up as a cause by the institutions of the Christian Church, where the debate prevailed with great intensity for well over 1,000 years. The Old Testament decrees were resurrected and a New Testament reference to usury added to fuel the case. Building on the authority of these texts, the Roman Catholic Church had by the 4th century AD prohibited the taking of interest by the clergy, a rule which they extended in the 5th century to the laity. In the 8th century under Charlemagne, they pressed further and declared usury to be a general criminal offense. This anti-usury movement continued to gain momentum during the early Middle Ages and perhaps reached its zenith in 1311 when Pope Clement V made the ban on usury absolute and declared all secular legislation in its favor null and void. Increasingly thereafter, and despite numerous subsequent prohibitions by popes and civil legislators, loopholes in the law and contradictions in the Church's arguments were found, and along with the growing tide of commercialization, the pro-usury counter-movement began to grow. The rise of Protestantism and its pro-capitalism influence is also associated with this change. But it should be noted that both Luther and Calvin expressed some reservations about the practice of usury despite their belief that it could not be universally condemned. Calvin, for instance, enumerated 7 crucial instances in which interest remained sinful, but these have been generally ignored and his stance taken as a wholesale sanctioning of interest. As a result of all these influences, sometime around 1620, according to theologian Rustin, usury passed from being an offense against public morality which a Christian government was expected to suppress to being a matter of private conscience, and a new generation of Christian moralists redefined usury as excessive interest. This position has remained pervasive through to present-day thinking in the Church, as the indicative views of the Church of Scotland suggest when it declares in its study report on the ethics of investment and banking, "We accept that the practice of charging interest for business and personal loans is not, in itself, incompatible with Christian ethics." What is more difficult to determine is whether the interest rate charged is fair or excessive. The criticism of usury in Islam was well established during the Prophet Muhammad's life and reinforced by various of his teachings in the Holy Quran. Dating back to around 600 AD. Check out our video on the prohibition of usury in Islam. The original word used for usury in this text was riba, which literally means excess or addition. This was accepted to refer directly to interest on loans so that, according to Islamic economists by the time of Caliph Umar, the prohibition of interest was a well-established working principle integrated into the Islamic economic system. It is not true that this interpretation of usury has been universally accepted or applied in the Islamic world. Indeed, a school of Islamic thought which emerged in the 19th century, led by Sir Said, still argues for an interpretative differentiation between usury which it is claimed refers to consumptional lending, and interest, which they say refers to lending for commercial investment. We here at Wealth and Wisdom believe that all forms of usury, whether for consumption or for investment, is categorically haram and forbidden for a practicing Muslim. We will continue with the critique of usury in our next video. If you found this video interesting and educational, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.